The morning sun cast long shadows across the steps of Denver's downtown courthouse. Isabella Rodriguez clutched her worn leather purse tighter as she walked through the heavy glass doors. Today was supposed to be the day everything changed. After months of fear, sleepless nights, and countless phone calls to lawyers, she was finally going to get the protection she desperately needed. Isabella had been married to Tony Mendez for 8 years. What started as a loving relationship slowly turned into a nightmare. The first time he hit her, Tony cried and promised it would never happen again. But it did happen again. And again. Each time was worse than the last. The bruises on her arms had finally faded from their last fight 3 weeks ago. That was the night Isabella decided she couldn't take it anymore. She packed a small bag, took their daughter Sophia to her mother's house, and never went back. The restraining order she filed was temporary. Today's hearing would make it permanent. Isabella's lawyer, Mrs. Patricia Coleman, met her in the courthouse lobby. Mrs. Coleman was a kind woman in her 50s who specialized in domestic violence cases. She had seen hundreds of women like Isabella walk through these doors, each carrying their own story of survival. "How are you feeling today?" Mrs. Coleman asked, placing a gentle hand on Isabella's shoulder. "Scared," Isabella admitted, "but ready. I want this to be over." They walked through the metal detectors together. The security guard, Officer Davis, was the same man who had been working there for 15 years. He knew Mrs. Coleman well and always treated her clients with respect. He smiled warmly at Isabella as she placed her purse on the conveyor belt. "You're doing the right thing," he whispered as she walked through the scanner. The courthouse was busier than usual. Families with children sat on wooden benches waiting for their cases to be called. Lawyers in dark suits hurried past with thick files under their arms. The sound of footsteps echoed off the marble floors. Isabella and Mrs. Coleman found seats near the back of courtroom 4B. Judge Williams would be hearing their case at 10:30 a.m. It was only 10:15, but Isabella wanted to be early. She had waited too long for this day to risk being late. As they sat waiting, Isabella's mind wandered back to the last conversation she had with Tony. He had called her mother's house the night before, begging her to drop the case. His voice was different than usual, not angry or threatening, but desperate. "Please, Bella," he had said, using the nickname only he called her. "We can work this out. Think about Sophia. She needs both her parents." But Isabella knew better. She had heard these promises before. Tony would be good for a few weeks, maybe even a few months. But eventually the anger would return, and next time she might not be so lucky. "Rodriguez versus Mendez," the court clerk called out. Isabella's heart started beating faster. This was it. She followed Mrs. Coleman to the front of the courtroom. Judge Williams, a stern-looking woman with gray hair, sat behind the tall wooden bench. She had been a judge for over 20 years and had seen every kind of case imaginable. The courtroom wasn't full, but there were about 30 people scattered across the wooden benches. Some were waiting for their own cases. Others were law students observing the proceedings. A few reporters sat in the back, covering various cases for the local newspaper. Mrs. Coleman began presenting Isabella's case. She showed photographs of Isabella's injuries, hospital records, and police reports. Each piece of evidence painted a clear picture of abuse that had gone on for years. Isabella sat at the plaintiff's table, trying to stay calm. She looked around the courtroom and noticed the security guards standing near the doors. There were 2 of them, both looking professional and alert. It made her feel safer, but then something caught her eye. In the back corner of the courtroom, she saw a familiar figure. Her blood ran cold. It was Tony. He wasn't supposed to be there. The temporary restraining order clearly stated he had to stay at least 100 yards away from her. But there he was, sitting in the last row, wearing a dark baseball cap pulled low over his face. Isabella tugged on Mrs. Coleman's sleeve. "He's here," she whispered urgently. Mrs. Coleman turned around and immediately spotted Tony. Her face went pale. She quickly approached the bench and spoke quietly to Judge Williams. "Your Honor, the defendant is in violation of the temporary restraining order by being present in this courtroom." Judge Williams looked toward the back of the room. Tony was trying to look invisible, but once you knew where to look, he was obvious. "Bailiff," Judge Williams called. "Please escort Mr. Mendez from the courtroom immediately." But as the bailiff started walking toward Tony, something unexpected happened. Instead of leaving quietly, Tony stood up and started walking toward the front of the courtroom. His movements were slow and deliberate, like a man who had already made up his mind about something. "Sir, you need to leave immediately," the bailiff said firmly. Tony ignored him and kept walking. People in the courtroom started to notice the commotion. Some turned in their seats to get a better look. Others sensed trouble and began moving toward the exits. Isabella felt panic rising in her chest. She knew that look in Tony's eyes. She had seen it before, right before the worst fights. But this was different. They were in a courthouse, surrounded by security guards and law enforcement. Surely nothing could happen here. "Mr. Mendez, stop where you are," Judge Williams commanded from the bench. But Tony didn't stop. He was now halfway down the aisle, his eyes locked on Isabella. She could see his hands trembling, but not from fear, from rage. The court stenographer, Janet Kim, continued typing, capturing every word that was being said. She had been doing this job for 12 years and had seen her share of disruptions. But something about this felt different, more dangerous. Mrs. Coleman stepped in front of Isabella, trying to shield her client. "Your Honor, we need security now." The two bailiffs were moving toward Tony, but the courtroom was crowded, and they had to navigate around people and furniture. Tony was moving faster now, almost jogging toward the front. "Tony, please," Isabella called out, hoping to reason with him. "Don't do this. Think about Sophia." For a moment, Tony's face softened at the mention of their daughter, but then his expression hardened again. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something that made everyone in the courtroom gasp. It was a knife. The blade was about 6 inches long and caught the light from the fluorescent fixtures above. Several people in the courtroom screamed. Parents grabbed their children and headed for the doors. Lawyers dove under tables, "Everyone down," one of the bailiffs shouted, but Tony was already running. He vaulted over the wooden barrier that separated the gallery from the court area and landed just a few feet from where Isabella sat. Judge Williams was frantically pressing the panic button under her desk, but help seemed impossibly far away. The bailiffs were still trying to get through the chaos of people trying to escape. Isabella looked into Tony's eyes and saw something that terrified her more than the knife in his hand. She saw a man who had nothing left to lose. A man who had decided that if he couldn't have her, nobody could. Time seemed to slow down as Tony raised the knife above his head. The knife came down fast, but Isabella was faster. Years of living with Tony had taught her to read the warning signs, to duck when she saw that look in his eyes. She rolled sideways out of her chair just as the blade sliced through the air where her head had been a split second before. The knife hit the wooden table with a loud thunk, sending papers flying everywhere. Mrs. Coleman screamed and stumbled backward, knocking over a chair. Judge Williams was shouting something from the bench, but her words were lost in the chaos that had erupted throughout the courtroom. Tony pulled the knife from the table and turned to follow Isabella, who was now crawling desperately toward the witness stand. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Behind her, she could hear Tony's heavy breathing and the sound of his footsteps on the marble floor. "You can't leave me," Tony shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. "You can't take Sophia away from me." Bailiff Rodriguez was the first to reach them. He was a big man, over 6 feet tall and built like a football player. He had been working courthouse security for 8 years and had dealt with his share of difficult situations. But he had never seen anything quite like this. "Drop the weapon now," Bailiff Rodriguez commanded, his own hand moving toward his service weapon. Tony spun around, the knife still clutched in his fist. His face was red and streaked with tears. "She's my wife," he screamed. "She belongs with me." "Sir, I need you to put the knife down and step away from the woman," Bailiff Rodriguez said, trying to keep his voice calm and steady. But Tony was beyond reasoning. The months of Isabella leaving him, the legal papers, the court dates, it had all built up inside him until something finally snapped. He looked back at Isabella, who was now pressed against the witness stand, trapped with nowhere else to go. The second bailiff, Officer Thompson, was trying to clear the courtroom. "Everyone out! Everyone out now!" he shouted, herding the remaining spectators toward the exits. But not everyone was leaving. Janet Kim, the court stenographer, was still at her machine, her fingers flying across the keys as she recorded everything that was happening. She knew this transcript would be important evidence later, assuming anyone survived to use it. A lawyer named Robert Chen, who had been waiting for his own case to be called, saw Isabella trapped near the witness stand. Without thinking, he grabbed a heavy law book from one of the tables and threw it at Tony's back. The book hit Tony between the shoulder blades, causing him to stumble forward. It wasn't enough to knock him down, but it gave Bailiff Rodriguez the opening he needed. He lunged forward and grabbed Tony's wrist, trying to wrestle the knife away from him. The two men crashed into the jury box, sending chairs flying in all directions. Tony was smaller than the bailiff, but desperation gave him strength. He twisted and kicked, fighting with everything he had. "Help him!" Judge Williams shouted at Officer Thompson. But Officer Thompson was dealing with his own crisis. In their panic to escape, several people had fallen near the courtroom doors, creating a pile of bodies that was blocking the exit. An elderly man was on the bottom, gasping for air. A young mother was crying because she couldn't find her child in the confusion. Isabella watched the two men fighting just a few feet away from her. The knife was still in Tony's hand, and both men were trying to control it. She could see the blade waving dangerously close to Bailiff Rodriguez's face. She looked around desperately for something to help with. Her eyes landed on the heavy wooden gavel that Judge Williams had dropped when she dove for cover behind the bench. Isabella crawled toward it, keeping low to avoid the fighting men. As she reached for the gavel, she heard a sound that made her blood run cold. It was a wet, slicing sound, followed by Bailiff Rodriguez crying out in pain. The knife had found its mark. Bailiff Rodriguez was holding his left arm, blood seeping through his fingers. Tony had broken free and was now turning back toward Isabella. "You did this to me," Tony screamed at her. "Everything was fine until you started listening to those lawyers." Isabella grabbed the gavel and held it in front of her like a weapon. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. "Tony, please," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Think about what you're doing. Sophia needs her father, but she needs him to be a good man, not this." For just a moment, Tony hesitated. The mention of their daughter always seemed to get through to him, even in his darkest moments. But then his face hardened again. "She needs both her parents together," he said, raising the knife again. That's when Officer Thompson finally made it across the courtroom. He had managed to get most of the civilians out and had called for backup on his radio. Now he was moving toward Tony with his weapon drawn. "Police! Drop the knife immediately." Tony whirled around to face this new threat. His eyes were wild now, darting between Officer Thompson, Isabella, and the wounded Bailiff Rodriguez, who was still trying to get back on his feet. The courtroom had become eerily quiet. Most of the spectators were gone, leaving only the main players in this deadly drama. Judge Williams was still crouched behind her bench, occasionally peering over the edge. Janet Kim had finally stopped typing, her hands frozen over the keys as she watched the scene unfold. "You don't understand," Tony said to Officer Thompson. "She's taking my daughter away from me. She's destroying my family." "I understand you're hurt," Officer Thompson replied, keeping his weapon aimed at Tony's chest. "But this isn't the way to fix it. Put the knife down and we can talk about this." Tony laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Talk? I tried talking. I tried begging. I tried everything, but she won't listen." He took a step toward Isabella, and Officer Thompson's finger tightened on the trigger. "Sir, that's your last warning. Drop the weapon now." But Tony was beyond warnings. He was beyond reason. He was a man who had lost everything that mattered to him, and he had decided that if he couldn't have his family, then nobody could. He raised the knife above his head again and charged toward Isabella. The sound of the gunshot was deafeningly loud in the enclosed courtroom. It echoed off the walls and seemed to hang in the air for several seconds. Tony stopped mid-charge, a look of surprise crossing his face. He looked down at his chest where a dark stain was beginning to spread across his white shirt. The knife fell from his hand and clattered across the floor. Tony swayed for a moment, then collapsed, his body hitting the marble floor with a sickening thud. Isabella stared at the motionless form of the man who had terrorized her for years. Even lying there bleeding, she was afraid he might suddenly jump up and come after her again. Officer Thompson kept his weapon pointed at Tony as he approached carefully. "Medic," he shouted into his radio. "We need medical assistance in courtroom 4B immediately." Judge Williams finally emerged from behind her bench, her face pale and her hands shaking. In 30 years on the bench, she had never seen anything like this. Bailiff Rodriguez was sitting against the jury box, pressing his uniform shirt against his wounded arm. The cut was deep but not life-threatening, and Isabella sat on the floor next to the witness stand, still clutching the gavel, wondering if the nightmare was finally over. The ambulance sirens were still wailing outside the courthouse when the first video hit the internet. A law student named Michael Park had been recording the proceedings on his phone for a class project when the chaos erupted. His shaky footage captured the entire 3-minute attack, from Tony jumping over the barrier to the final gunshot that ended it all. Michael's hands were trembling as he stared at his phone screen. He knew he had captured something important, something that people needed to see. But he also knew that sharing it would change everything, not just for him, but for Isabella and everyone else involved. After 20 minutes of internal debate, he uploaded the video to social media with a simple caption. "This just happened at Denver courthouse. Woman attacked during restraining order hearing. This is why the system is broken." The video was grainy and the audio was muffled, but the violence was clear enough to shock anyone who watched it. Within the first hour, it had been shared over 1,000 times. By the second hour, major news outlets were reaching out to Michael for permission to use his footage. At Denver General Hospital, Isabella lay in a bed in the emergency room, physically unharmed but emotionally shattered. Mrs. Coleman sat beside her, both women trying to process what had just happened. Neither of them knew that Isabella's story was already spreading across the globe. Dr. Amanda Foster, the emergency room physician treating Isabella, had seen many domestic violence victims over her 15-year career, but she had never seen one who had been attacked in what should have been the safest place possible, a courtroom full of law enforcement officers. "I keep thinking about all the other women," Isabella whispered to Mrs. Coleman. "How many of them are going through the same thing right now? How many of them think the courthouse will protect them?" Mrs. Coleman squeezed Isabella's hand. She didn't have an answer. In her 20 years of practicing family law, she had always believed that the legal system, while imperfect, would ultimately protect the innocent. Today had shaken that faith to its core. Meanwhile, 3,000 miles away in Los Angeles, a domestic violence advocate named Jennifer Walsh was scrolling through social media during her lunch break when she saw Michael's video. Jennifer had spent the last 10 years helping women escape abusive relationships, and she immediately recognized the terrifying reality of what she was watching. Jennifer shared the video on her own social media accounts, which had over 50,000 followers. Her caption read, "This is what happens when the system fails women. Isabella Rodriguez could have been any one of us. How many more women have to die before we fix this?" The video was also being watched in London, where a family law barrister named Catherine Morrison was preparing for her own domestic violence case the next day. Catherine had seen the weaknesses in the British court system firsthand. Watching Isabella's attack made her realize that these problems existed everywhere, not just in her own country. Catherine immediately began researching courthouse security protocols around the world. What she found was disturbing. Most courthouses had basic metal detectors, but very few had specific protections for domestic violence victims. Many didn't even have separate entrances or waiting areas for abuse survivors and their attackers. In Seoul, South Korea, a women's rights activist named Lin Jo was preparing for bed when she received a message from a friend in America. "You need to see this," the message said, followed by a link to Michael's video. Lin had been fighting for better domestic violence protections in South Korea for years. The country had made progress in recent years, but courthouse security was still lacking. As she watched Isabella's attack, Lin realized this was the kind of story that could wake people up around the world. Lin translated key parts of the video and shared it on Korean social media platforms. She also reached out to women's rights organizations in China, Japan, and other Asian countries, asking them to share Isabella's story with their own followers. By the end of the first day, the video had been viewed over 2 million times. News stations across America were running the story, and international media was starting to pick it up as well. But it wasn't just the video that was spreading. People were sharing their own stories of courthouse security failures. Women from Australia, Canada, the United Kingdom, and dozens of other countries were posting about times when they felt unsafe seeking legal protection from their abusers. A hashtag began trending: courthouse safety. Under this tag, hundreds of women shared photos of their injuries, court documents, and stories of times when the legal system had failed to protect them. Rebecca Thompson, a survivor from Manchester, England, posted, "My ex-husband followed me into the courthouse and threatened me right outside the courtroom. Security said they couldn't do anything because he hadn't technically broken any laws yet. I was terrified to go back for my next hearing. Maria Gonzalez from Madrid, Spain shared. The courthouse here has no metal detectors at all. When I told the judge I was afraid my ex-boyfriend might try to hurt me, he said that was a police matter, not a court matter. But the police told me to get a restraining order from the court. No one wanted to help. In Australia, domestic violence counselor Helen Roberts was monitoring the social media explosion from her office in Sydney. Helen had been advocating for better courthouse protections for years, but had struggled to get politicians to pay attention. Suddenly, with Isabella's story going viral, she was getting calls from reporters and government officials who wanted to know about courthouse security in Australia. This isn't just an American problem, Helen told a local news reporter. Our courthouses have the same vulnerabilities. We've just been lucky that we haven't had an attack like this caught on camera. The video was also making its way to government officials around the world. In Canada, Justice Minister David Anderson was shown the footage during a morning briefing. Anderson had 3 daughters of his own, and watching Isabella's terror-filled face as she tried to escape her attacker made him physically sick. Get me a full report on courthouse security across Canada, Anderson told his staff. I want to know every weakness, every vulnerability, and I want it by tomorrow morning. Similar conversations were happening in capital cities across the globe. The combination of shocking video footage and the flood of personal stories from other survivors was creating pressure that politicians couldn't ignore. Back in Denver, Isabella was finally being discharged from the hospital. Mrs. Coleman had tried to shield her from the media attention, but it was impossible. Reporters were camped outside the hospital, and Isabella's phone was buzzing constantly with interview requests. I don't want to be famous, Isabella told Mrs. Coleman as they walked to the car. I just wanted to be safe. But Isabella's story was bigger than her now. It had become a symbol of everything that was wrong with how the world treated domestic violence survivors. Women everywhere were looking to her as proof that the system needed to change. That night, as Isabella tried to sleep in her mother's house with little Sophia, she had no idea that her 3 minutes of terror had started a movement that would spread to every continent on Earth. The digital wildfire was just beginning to burn. Within 48 hours of the courthouse attack, Isabella's story had reached every corner of the world. What started as a single video on social media had transformed into a global conversation about how society protects its most vulnerable citizens. In London, Home Secretary David Richardson was having the worst week of his political career. His morning briefing had been dominated by questions about courthouse security in the United Kingdom. The video from Denver had sparked hundreds of British women to share their own frightening experiences with inadequate court protections. Minister, his chief of staff said, placing a thick folder on his desk, we've received over 3,000 complaints in the past 2 days, all of them about courthouse security failures. Richardson opened the folder and began reading. The stories were heartbreaking and eerily similar to Isabella's case. Women who had been followed into courthouses by their abusers. Victims who had been threatened in courthouse hallways while waiting for their hearings. Survivors who had been too afraid to return to court because of inadequate security. One letter particularly caught his attention. It was from Janet Morrison, a 28-year-old teacher from Birmingham who had been stalked by her ex-boyfriend for months. I went to court 3 times seeking protection, Janet had written. Each time my ex-boyfriend was allowed to sit just a few rows behind me. There were no metal detectors, no security screening, no separate waiting areas. I could feel him staring at me throughout the entire hearing. The judge granted my restraining order, but I was too terrified to walk to my car alone. What good is legal protection if you're not physically safe while seeking it? Richardson closed the folder and looked out his office window at the protests that had been growing outside Parliament House for the past 2 days. Hundreds of women held signs with Isabella's photo and messages demanding courthouse security reform. Across the English Channel in Paris, similar scenes were playing out. French Justice Minister Claire Dubois was facing her own crisis as French women began sharing their courthouse security horror stories. The French media had picked up Isabella's story and was comparing it to several recent cases where French domestic violence victims had been attacked or threatened while seeking legal protection. The most shocking French case involved a woman named Anne Laurent, who had been stabbed by her ex-husband in the parking lot of a courthouse in Lyon just 6 months earlier. Anne had survived the attack, but the incident had received minimal media coverage at the time. Now, with Isabella's story making global headlines, French journalists were revisiting Anne's case and asking why more hadn't been done to prevent it. The Isabella Rodriguez case could have happened in any French courthouse, wrote prominent feminist journalist Sophie Martin in Le Monde. Our courthouses are just as vulnerable, our security just as inadequate, our systems just as broken. In Germany, the response was even more dramatic. German women's rights organizations had organized coordinated protests in Berlin, Munich, Hamburg, and 12 other cities. The protests were peaceful but powerful, with thousands of women sharing their own stories of feeling unsafe while seeking legal protection. Dr. Elena Richter, a criminology professor at the University of Berlin, had spent her career studying domestic violence patterns across Europe. She had been following Isabella's story closely and was struck by how it had exposed a universal problem. This isn't about American gun violence or American court systems, Dr. Richter told a packed lecture hall at her university. This is about how every society treats women who are trying to escape abuse. Isabella Rodriguez's story resonates globally because women everywhere recognize her fear, her vulnerability, and the system's failure to protect her. Dr. Richter had been compiling data on courthouse security failures across Europe for the past 2 years. Her research showed that domestic violence victims were attacked or threatened while seeking legal protection at alarming rates across the continent. But until Isabella's story went viral, no one had been paying attention to her findings. Now, Dr. Richter was fielding calls from government officials, journalists, and advocacy organizations across Europe, all wanting to understand the scope of the problem. Her research was suddenly front-page news in multiple countries. In Australia, the response was particularly swift. Prime Minister James Morrison called an emergency meeting with state premiers to discuss courthouse security. The meeting was prompted not just by Isabella's story, but by the flood of similar stories from Australian women that had emerged in response to the Denver attack. One of the most disturbing Australian stories came from Melbourne, where a woman named Lisa Chen had been attacked by her ex-partner's brother outside a courthouse 3 months earlier. The brother had been hired by Lisa's ex-partner to intimidate her into dropping her domestic violence charges. The man who attacked me wasn't even the person I was filing charges against, Lisa told Australian Broadcasting Corporation. He was hired muscle, sent to scare me away from court. Security cameras captured the whole thing, but by the time courthouse security responded, I was already on the ground with a broken nose and 3 cracked ribs. Lisa's story, combined with dozens of others, convinced Prime Minister Morrison that immediate action was needed. Within hours of his meeting with state premiers, he announced that the federal government would be introducing emergency legislation to improve courthouse security nationwide. In Canada, Justice Minister David Anderson was dealing with his own avalanche of similar stories. The combination of Isabella's viral video and the outpouring of Canadian women sharing their own experiences had created political pressure that couldn't be ignored. The most compelling Canadian story came from Vancouver, where a woman named Patricia Williams had been followed into a courthouse by her abusive ex-husband, despite having an active restraining order against him. He sat 2 seats away from me in the waiting area, Patricia told a Canadian television reporter. He whispered threats to me while we waited for our case to be called. When I told courthouse security, they said they couldn't do anything unless he physically touched me. So I had to sit there terrified, while he promised to kill me in a voice quiet enough that only I could hear. The Canadian stories were similar to ones emerging from every country where Isabella's video had been shared. The details varied, but the core problem was the same everywhere. Courthouses weren't designed to protect domestic violence victims from their abusers. In Brazil, women's rights activist Carmen Rodriguez, no relation to Isabella, had organized the largest domestic violence protest in the country's history. Over 50,000 women marched through the streets of São Paulo, carrying photos of Isabella and demanding courthouse security reforms. Isabella Rodriguez is every woman, Carmen told the massive crowd. She is our sister, our daughter, our friend. Her terror is our terror. Her survival is our hope. The Brazilian protests were particularly emotional because domestic violence rates in the country were among the highest in the world. Brazilian women saw themselves in Isabella's story and demanded that their government take immediate action to prevent similar attacks. In Japan, the response was more subtle but equally significant. Japanese women's rights organizations had a long history of working within the system, rather than organizing large public protests. But Isabella's story had sparked something different, a quiet but determined movement to reform Japanese courthouse procedures. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a legal scholar at Tokyo University, had been studying domestic violence laws across Asia for the past decade. She immediately recognized the universal nature of the problems exposed by Isabella's case. Japanese courthouses have many of the same vulnerabilities we see in the American video, Dr. Tanaka explained to a group of government officials. We require both parties to be present for domestic violence hearings, often in the same waiting areas. We have minimal security screening. We provide no special protections for victims who fear their abusers might become violent. Dr. Tanaka's research, combined with Isabella's story, convinced Japanese officials that changes were needed. Within days, the Japanese Justice Ministry announced it would be reviewing courthouse security procedures nationwide. The global awakening that Isabella's story had sparked was unprecedented. Never before had a single domestic violence case captured international attention in such a dramatic way. But more importantly, never before had so many women around the world simultaneously recognized their shared vulnerability and demanded change. As Isabella sat in her mother's house in Denver, trying to shield her daughter Sophia from the media attention, she had no idea that her 3 minutes of terror had become a catalyst for the largest international domestic violence reform movement in history. The world was finally ready to listen. The hospital room was quiet except for the steady beeping of the heart monitor. Isabella had been moved to a private room after her initial treatment, partly for her medical care but mostly to shield her from the hundreds of reporters who had gathered outside Denver General Hospital. Mrs. Coleman sat beside Isabella's bed, her laptop open as she scrolled through news coverage from around the world. The story had taken on a life of its own. What started as a local domestic violence case had become an international symbol of systemic failure. "Look at this," Mrs. Coleman said, turning her laptop screen toward Isabella. "This is from the BBC in London. They're calling you the woman whose terror changed the world." Isabella shook her head weakly. She was physically unharmed but emotionally exhausted. The trauma of the attack, combined with the overwhelming media attention, had left her feeling like she was living in a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. "I don't want to be a symbol," Isabella whispered. "I just want my daughter to be safe." But symbol or not, Isabella's story was driving political action at the highest levels of government around the world. In her 40 years of practicing law, Mrs. Coleman had never seen anything like it. In Ottawa, Canadian Prime Minister Robert Chen was holding his third emergency meeting in as many days. The pressure from Canadian women's groups had become impossible to ignore. His office had received over 20,000 emails demanding immediate action on courthouse security, and protests were planned for every major Canadian city. "How many similar incidents have we had in Canada?" Prime Minister Chen asked his Justice Minister. Justice Minister Anderson placed a thick file on the conference table. 14 documented cases in the past 2 years where domestic violence victims were attacked or threatened while seeking legal protection. Those are just the ones that were officially reported. The number hit Prime Minister Chen like a physical blow. 14 women who had been failed by the system he was responsible for overseeing. 14 women who could have been killed while seeking protection from the courts. "And how many of these cases made national news?" he asked. "None," Anderson replied quietly. "Not until now." Prime Minister Chen stood up and walked to the window overlooking Parliament Hill. Outside, he could see protesters carrying signs with Isabella's photo and messages demanding action. The crowd had been growing larger each day. "We're introducing emergency legislation," he decided. "Full courthouse security reform, separate entrances for domestic violence victims, mandatory security screening, panic buttons in every courtroom. I want it drafted within 48 hours. Similar conversations were happening in capital cities across the globe. In London, Home Secretary Richardson was facing the most intense political pressure of his career. The British media had uncovered dozens of courthouse security failures, and opposition members were calling for his resignation if immediate action wasn't taken. The most damaging revelation had come from investigative journalist Michael Wright, who had discovered that the British government had received a security assessment 3 years earlier, recommending courthouse safety improvements. The report had been shelved due to budget concerns, Women have been asking for these protections for years, opposition leader Janet Morrison told a packed House of Commons. The government had a report detailing exactly these problems 3 years ago. How many women have been attacked, threatened, or killed because this government chose to ignore expert recommendations? Richardson had no good answer. The security assessment report was clear and comprehensive. It had recommended metal detectors, separate waiting areas for domestic violence cases, enhanced security training, and emergency response protocols. All of the measures that might have prevented an attack like the one Isabella had suffered. Under intense parliamentary pressure, Richardson announced that the British government would be introducing the most comprehensive courthouse security legislation in the country's history. The bill would implement all of the recommendations from the shelved report and more. In Berlin, German Chancellor Angela Weber was facing her own political crisis. German women's rights organizations had organized massive protests across the country, and European Union officials were pressing for continent-wide courthouse security standards. The German protests were particularly powerful because they included not just German women, but refugees and immigrants from countries where domestic violence protections were even weaker. These women saw Isabella's story as proof that even in advanced Western countries, women weren't truly safe when seeking legal protection. Chancellor Weber called an emergency session of the German parliament, something that had only been done a handful of times in the country's post-war history. The session would focus entirely on domestic violence prevention and courthouse security. The Isabella Rodriguez case has exposed failures in our system that we can no longer ignore, Chancellor Weber told the packed parliamentary chamber. Every woman who seeks protection from our courts deserves to feel safe doing so. That is not currently the case, and we must change it immediately. In Australia, Prime Minister Morrison was dealing with his own parliamentary crisis. Australian women's groups had organized coordinated protests in every state capital, and the opposition was threatening a no-confidence vote if immediate action wasn't taken. The Australian response was complicated by the country's federal system, where courthouse security was managed by individual states rather than the national government. This meant that reforms would require cooperation between the federal government and 8 separate state and territory governments. But Isabella's story had created such powerful public pressure that political barriers that normally seemed impossible were suddenly surmountable. Within 72 hours of Isabella's attack, all 8 Australian state and territory leaders had agreed to coordinate on comprehensive courthouse security reforms. "This is bigger than politics," said Victoria, Premier Amanda Chen. "This is about fundamental human safety. When women are afraid to seek legal protection because they might be attacked in the process, our entire justice system has failed." In France, the political response was swift and decisive. French Justice Minister Dubois announced that France would implement emergency courthouse security measures within 30 days, followed by comprehensive legislation within 90 days. The French announcement was particularly significant because France had been reluctant to admit that domestic violence was a serious problem in the country, but Isabella's story, combined with the stories of French women who had suffered similar courthouse security failures, had made denial impossible. "We can no longer pretend that domestic violence is someone else's problem," Justice Minister Dubois told the French National Assembly. Isabella Rodriguez's terror could have been the terror of any French woman seeking protection from an abusive partner. In Tokyo, the Japanese government's response was more measured but equally significant. Japanese officials announced that they would be implementing a complete review of courthouse security procedures, with reforms to be implemented within 6 months. The Japanese announcement was particularly important because Japan had historically been resistant to outside pressure on domestic policy issues. But Isabella's story had resonated so strongly with Japanese women that the government felt compelled to act. The safety of women seeking legal protection is not a Western issue or an Eastern issue, said Japanese Justice Minister Hiroshi Tanaka. It is a human issue that requires immediate attention. Even in countries with limited resources, governments were finding ways to respond to the pressure generated by Isabella's story. In Mexico, where courthouse security had been chronically underfunded, the government announced that it would be partnering with international organizations to improve protection for domestic violence victims. In India, where domestic violence cases often received minimal attention, Women's rights groups used Isabella's story to demand better courthouse protections. The Indian government announced that it would be implementing new security protocols in major cities, with plans to expand the program nationwide. Back in Denver, Isabella was finally beginning to understand the global impact of her story. Mrs. Coleman had been showing her news coverage from around the world, and Isabella was overwhelmed by the response. "All these women," Isabella said, looking at photos of protests in London, Berlin, and Sydney. "They're all fighting because of what happened to me? They're fighting because what happened to you could happen to any of them," Mrs. Coleman replied. "Your story made them realize that the system isn't protecting any of us the way it should." As Isabella looked at the faces of women from around the world who were demanding change, she began to understand that her trauma might have a purpose beyond her own survival. Her 3 minutes of terror had become a catalyst for protecting countless other women. The political tipping point had been reached. Now the real work of reform would begin. The lights in government buildings across the world stayed on all night. From Washington, D.C. to Tokyo, from London to Sydney, teams of lawyers, policy experts, and government officials worked around the clock to draft legislation that could prevent another attack like the one Isabella had suffered. In the United States Capitol, congressional staffers were experiencing something they had rarely seen in their careers: genuine bipartisan cooperation. The video of Isabella's attack had been so shocking that it had cut through the usual political divisions that paralyzed most legislative efforts. Senator Patricia Williams, chairwoman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, had called an emergency session for 6 a.m. on a Saturday morning. The hearing room was packed with domestic violence advocates, courthouse security experts, and family law attorneys who had flown in from across the country. "We are here because the system failed Isabella Rodriguez in the most dramatic and public way possible," Senator Williams began, "but Isabella is not the first woman this system has failed, and unless we act immediately, she will not be the last." The hearing moved at unprecedented speed. Normally, Senate committees took weeks or months to review complex legislation, but the political pressure generated by Isabella's story had created a sense of urgency that cut through the usual procedural delays. Dr. Robert Chen, a courthouse security expert from Georgetown University, presented research showing that domestic violence victims were attacked while seeking legal protection at rates far higher than anyone had previously realized. We've documented over 300 cases in the past 5 years where domestic violence victims were attacked, threatened, or intimidated while on courthouse property, Dr. Chen testified. "These are just the cases that were officially reported. The actual number is likely much higher." The statistics were shocking, but what moved the senators more were the personal stories. Isabella's lawyer, Mrs. Coleman, had flown to Washington to testify about her client's experience and the similar cases she had encountered in her practice. Isabella's attack was terrifying, but it wasn't unique, Mrs. Coleman told the packed hearing room. "I've had clients who were followed into courthouses, threatened in hallways, and intimidated in parking lots. The courthouse should be the one place where women seeking protection feel completely safe. Right now, it's often the place where they feel most vulnerable." While the American Congress worked through the weekend, similar scenes were playing out in parliaments around the world. In London, Home Secretary Richardson had assembled a team of 30 legal experts to draft comprehensive courthouse security legislation in just 72 hours. The team included police officers, court administrators, domestic violence advocates, and security technology specialists. The British team was working with a particular sense of urgency because they had discovered that their courthouse security was actually worse than what Isabella had encountered in Denver. Most British courthouses had no metal detectors at all, and many had no security guards specifically trained to handle domestic violence situations. "We're essentially starting from scratch," admitted Chief Inspector David Morrison, who was leading the security assessment team. "Our current courthouse security was designed to handle general disruptions, not targeted attacks by domestic abusers." The British team was studying courthouse security systems from around the world, looking for best practices they could implement quickly. They were particularly interested in specialized courthouses in Australia that had been designed specifically for domestic violence cases. In Berlin, Chancellor Weber had authorized unlimited overtime for government staff working on courthouse security reforms. The German team was taking a characteristically thorough approach. conducting detailed risk assessments of every major courthouse in the country. The German effort was being led by Dr. Elena Richter, the criminology professor whose research had suddenly become internationally relevant. Dr. Richter was working with architects, security experts, and technology specialists to design courthouse modifications that could be implemented rapidly, but would provide long-term protection. "We're not just adding metal detectors," Dr. Richter explained to a late-night planning session. "We're completely reimagining how courthouses handle domestic violence cases. Separate entrances, secure waiting areas, panic buttons in every courtroom, and specially trained security personnel." The German plan was ambitious, but Chancellor Weber had made it clear that cost was not a concern. The political pressure generated by Isabella's story had created a rare moment when comprehensive reform was possible. In Tokyo, the Japanese approach was more methodical, but equally intensive. Japanese Justice Ministry officials were working with court administrators from across the country to develop security protocols that could be implemented uniformly nationwide. The Japanese team was particularly focused on technology solutions. They were exploring advanced security systems, including facial recognition software that could identify known domestic abusers and alert security personnel when they entered courthouse buildings. "Japan has always been a leader in security technology," explained Justice Minister Tanaka. "We should use that expertise to make our courthouses the safest in the world for domestic violence victims." In Australia, the federal government was coordinating with 8 separate state and territory governments to develop unified courthouse security standards. This was normally a bureaucratic nightmare, but Isabella's story had created political pressure that overcame usual jurisdictional disputes. The Australian effort was being led by Helen Roberts, the domestic violence counselor from Sydney, who had been advocating for courthouse security reforms for years. Suddenly, her proposals that had been ignored for years were being fast-tracked for immediate implementation. "I've been trying to get these changes made for a decade," Roberts told Australian Broadcasting Corporation. "It's tragic that it took Isabella Rodriguez's attack to create the political will for action. But I'm grateful that something positive can come from her trauma." In Canada, Justice Minister Anderson was working with a team that included survivors of domestic violence, security experts, and courthouse administrators. The Canadian approach was focused on implementing changes that could be rolled out quickly across the country's diverse court system. The Canadian team was particularly interested in the use of technology to enhance security. They were exploring panic button systems that could instantly alert law enforcement if a domestic violence victim felt threatened anywhere on courthouse property. "We want to create a zone of absolute safety around every courthouse in Canada," Anderson explained to a midnight planning session. "No domestic violence victim should ever have to worry about their safety while seeking legal protection." In France, Justice Minister Dubois was taking a comprehensive approach that went beyond just courthouse security. The French plan included enhanced training for judges and court personnel on domestic violence dynamics, as well as improved coordination between courts and law enforcement. Isabella's attack exposed not just security failures, but broader systemic problems in how we handle domestic violence cases, Dubois explained to the French National Assembly. "We need to fix all of these problems, not just add more security guards." The international coordination was unprecedented. Government officials from different countries were sharing information and best practices in real time. Legal experts were collaborating across time zones to develop model legislation that could be adapted for different legal systems. Dr. Robert Chen, the Georgetown security expert, found himself consulting with government teams from 12 different countries, all working simultaneously to develop courthouse security reforms. "I've never seen anything like this level of international cooperation on a domestic policy issue," Dr. Chen said during a video conference with officials from 6 different countries. Isabella's story has created a unique moment where comprehensive reform is possible everywhere at once. The 72-hour sprint was exhausting for everyone involved, but the sense of purpose was extraordinary. Government officials who normally spent months debating minor policy changes were suddenly working together to draft comprehensive legislation in just 3 days. By Sunday evening, draft legislation was ready in multiple countries. The bills varied in their details, but they all shared common elements: enhanced security screening, separate facilities for domestic violence cases, specialized training for court personnel, and technology systems to provide immediate help to victims in danger. As the sun set on what government officials were already calling the most productive weekend in legislative history, Isabella was finally beginning to understand the global impact of her story. Mrs. Coleman had been keeping her updated on the international response, but the scale was almost impossible to comprehend. Governments around the world were spending millions of dollars and working around the clock to implement changes that would protect women like her. "Do you think it will work?" Isabella asked Mrs. Coleman as they watched the news coverage of the legislative efforts. "I think your 3 minutes of terror may have saved thousands of women from experiencing the same thing," Mrs. Coleman replied. The sprint was over. Now came the even bigger challenge of turning these emergency bills into lasting change. The first vote came at 3:47 a.m. in New Zealand. Parliament had been in session for 14 straight hours, debating the Emergency Courthouse Safety Act that had been drafted in response to Isabella's attack. When the final vote was tallied, it was unanimous: 120 votes in favor, 0 opposed. "This is for Isabella Rodriguez and every woman who has ever felt unsafe seeking justice," declared Prime Minister Jennifer Collins as she signed the bill into law just 20 minutes later. New Zealand will lead the world in courthouse safety. The New Zealand law was comprehensive. It required metal detectors and trained security personnel at every courthouse entrance. It mandated separate waiting areas and entrances for domestic violence cases. It installed panic buttons in every courtroom and established 24-hour monitoring systems for all courthouse security cameras. But most importantly, it created what would become known as the Isabella Protocol, a set of procedures designed specifically to protect domestic violence victims from the moment they arrived at a courthouse until they safely departed. 6 hours later, the Australian Parliament followed suit. The vote wasn't quite unanimous. 3 members were absent due to illness, but it was overwhelming: 147 votes in favor, 1 opposed, 2 abstaining. Prime Minister Morrison had tears in his eyes as he signed the Australian Courthouse Safety Act. "Isabella Rodriguez's courage has saved lives that we'll never know about," he said. "Women across Australia will be safer because she survived to tell her story." The Australian law went even further than New Zealand's. It established specialized domestic violence courts in every major city, with security systems designed specifically for high-risk cases. It also created a national database to track domestic abusers and alert court security when they entered any courthouse in the country. In Canada, the response was swift and decisive. The Canadian Parliament had worked through the weekend to prepare the Courthouse Protection Act, and when it came to a vote Monday morning, it passed by the largest margin of any bill in Canadian parliamentary history: 335 votes in favor, 3 opposed. "Isabella Rodriguez's story reminds us that domestic violence doesn't respect borders," said Prime Minister Chen as he signed the bill. "Neither should our response to protecting its victims." The Canadian law included innovative technology solutions. Every domestic violence victim would receive a special identification card that would automatically alert security when they entered a courthouse. Court personnel would be notified immediately, allowing them to provide additional protection and support. In the United Kingdom, the political response was even more dramatic. The British Parliament had called an emergency session, only the 7th time in British history that Parliament had convened for a domestic policy emergency. Home Secretary Richardson presented the Courthouse Safety and Domestic Violence Protection Act to a packed House of Commons. The bill had been developed in just 72 hours, but it was more comprehensive than legislation that normally took years to develop. Isabella Rodriguez's attack could have happened in any British courthouse, Richardson told Parliament. "Our current security systems are inadequate, and women are paying the price with their safety and sometimes their lives." The debate was passionate but brief. Member of Parliament after member shared stories from their own constituencies. Women who had been threatened, intimidated, or attacked while seeking legal protection. The vote was overwhelming: 623 votes in favor, 14 opposed. Queen Elizabeth II signed the bill into law within hours, using emergency royal prerogative powers that hadn't been used in decades. "The protection of our citizens is the highest duty of government," the Queen said in a rare public statement. This law honors Isabella Rodriguez's survival and ensures her suffering was not in vain. In Germany, Chancellor Weber had called for an emergency session of the Bundestag. The German Courthouse Security Act was debated for just 6 hours before coming to a vote. Lightning speed for the normally deliberative German parliament. Dr. Elena Richter testified before Parliament about her research into courthouse security failures across Europe. Her testimony was devastating, documenting dozens of cases where German women had been attacked or threatened while seeking legal protection. Isabella Rodriguez's story is not unique, Dr. Richter told the packed parliamentary chamber. It is simply the most visible example of a systemic failure that endangers women across Germany and throughout Europe. The German law passed by an overwhelming margin and included some of the most advanced security measures in the world. German courthouses would use facial recognition technology, advanced metal detectors, and specially trained domestic violence response teams. In France, Justice Minister Dubois had worked with domestic violence advocates to draft legislation that went beyond just security measures. The French Courthouse Protection and Domestic Violence Prevention Act included enhanced training for judges, improved coordination with law enforcement, and specialized support services for victims. The French Parliament debated the bill for 12 hours, with members sharing emotional testimony about domestic violence cases in their own districts. The final vote was decisive. 456 votes in favor, 23 opposed. Isabella Rodriguez's courage has awakened France to a problem we should have addressed years ago, said President Emmanuel Macron as he signed the bill. French women deserve to feel completely safe when seeking justice. In Japan, the response was characteristically thorough. The Japanese Diet had spent 3 days reviewing every aspect of the country's courthouse security systems before voting on comprehensive reforms. The Japanese Courthouse Safety Enhancement Act included cutting-edge technology solutions, including AI-powered threat assessment systems and advanced surveillance networks. But it also included cultural changes, such as specialized training for court personnel on trauma-informed approaches to working with domestic violence survivors. The vote was unanimous in both houses of the Japanese Diet, a rare show of complete political unity on a domestic policy issue. In Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, the response was coordinated across all 3 countries. The Scandinavian governments had worked together to develop unified courthouse security standards that could be implemented across the region. The Nordic Courthouse Safety Accord was signed by all 3 prime ministers in a ceremony that was broadcast live across Scandinavia. The accord included some of the most progressive protections in the world, including guaranteed legal representation for all domestic violence victims and specialized courts that handled only domestic violence cases. But perhaps the most significant response came from the United States, where Isabella's attack had originated. The American Congress had worked with unprecedented bipartisan cooperation to develop the Isabella Rodriguez Courthouse Safety Act. The bill included federal funding for courthouse security upgrades across all 50 states, mandatory training for all court personnel on domestic violence dynamics, and the establishment of specialized domestic violence courts in every major metropolitan area. When the bill came to a vote in the House of Representatives, it passed 417 to 1. The single opposing vote came from a congressman who objected to the federal spending, but even he said he supported the bill's goals. In the Senate, the vote was even more overwhelming, 97 to 0, with 3 senators absent due to illness. President Biden signed the bill in a ceremony at the White House with Isabella and Mrs. Coleman watching via video link from Denver. Isabella Rodriguez's courage in surviving this attack and sharing her story has made America safer, President Biden said as he signed the legislation. This law ensures that her trauma will protect countless other women from experiencing the same terror. By the end of 10 days, 10 nations had passed comprehensive courthouse security legislation. The speed was unprecedented in modern political history, but the international pressure generated by Isabella's story had created a unique moment when sweeping reform was possible. Isabella watched the signing ceremonies from her mother's house in Denver, still trying to process how her 3 minutes of terror had changed laws in countries she had never even visited. All these people, she said to Mrs. Coleman as they watched. The Japanese Prime Minister signed their courthouse security law. All these women will be safer because of what happened to me. Mrs. Coleman squeezed Isabella's hand. Your survival gave them hope that change was possible, she said. And your courage in sharing your story gave them the power to demand that change. The historic legislation wave was complete. Now came the even bigger challenge of implementing these new protections and ensuring they actually worked to protect women like Isabella. But for the first time since her attack, Isabella felt like something good might come from her trauma. Her story had started a movement that was already making the world safer for domestic violence survivors. The laws had been passed. Now it was time to put them into practice. 6 months after the attack that changed her life, Isabella sat in her wheelchair in front of a wall of computer screens, preparing to address the United Nations Human Rights Council. The injuries from Tony's attack had left her partially paralyzed, but her voice was stronger than ever. The UN meeting room in Geneva was packed with delegates from 193 countries, all there to hear Isabella tell her story and discuss the global courthouse security reforms that had followed her attack. Translators in glass booths prepared to carry her words to every corner of the world in dozens of languages. 6 months ago, I was just a scared woman trying to protect myself and my daughter, Isabella began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. I had no idea that my 3 minutes of terror would become a catalyst for change around the world. On the screens around her, Isabella could see the faces of delegates from countries she had only read about in news reports. But she could also see something else. The faces of women who understood her story because they had lived versions of it themselves. The Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, had invited Isabella to address the Council as part of a special session on domestic violence prevention. Her story had become a symbol of both the failures of current systems and the possibility for rapid, comprehensive reform. The Isabella Rodriguez protocols, as they had come to be known, were now being implemented in courthouses across the globe. The name still made Isabella uncomfortable. She didn't want to be famous for being attacked. But she had come to understand that her story could save other women's lives. In Denver, the courthouse where Isabella had been attacked had been completely renovated. The changes were dramatic and immediately visible. Separate entrances now allowed domestic violence victims to enter the building without encountering their abusers. Metal detectors and trained security personnel screened everyone entering the building. Panic buttons in every courtroom could summon immediate help. But the changes went deeper than just security measures. Judge Williams, who had presided over Isabella's hearing, had undergone extensive training on domestic violence dynamics and trauma-informed court procedures. She now understood that a victim's fear was not weakness, but wisdom, a recognition of real danger that courts needed to take. Seriously, Isabella's case taught me that domestic violence victims are the experts on their own safety, Judge Williams had told a conference of family court judges. When a woman says she's afraid, we need to believe her and protect her, not question whether her fear is justified. The physical improvements to courthouses were impressive, but the cultural changes were even more significant. Court personnel across the world had received training on recognizing the signs of domestic violence and responding appropriately to victims in crisis. Mrs. Coleman, Isabella's lawyer, had become an international expert on courthouse security, consulting with governments around the world on implementing the Isabella Rodriguez protocols. She traveled constantly now, helping courts in different countries adapt the security measures to their local legal systems and cultures. Isabella's story resonated globally because domestic violence is a universal problem, Mrs. Coleman explained to a group of European court administrators. The details vary from country to country, but the core issue is the same everywhere. Women need to feel safe when seeking legal protection. The technology solutions that had been developed in response to Isabella's case were particularly impressive. In Australia, facial recognition systems could now identify known domestic abusers when they entered courthouse buildings, automatically alerting security personnel. In Canada, special identification cards allowed domestic violence victims to request immediate assistance anywhere on courthouse property. In Germany, Dr. Elena Richter had established the International Courthouse Safety Research Center, which monitored the effectiveness of the new security measures and continued developing Improvements. Dr. Richter's research showed that courthouse attacks on domestic violence victims had dropped by 89% in countries that had implemented the Isabella Rodriguez protocols. The data is clear. Dr. Richter reported to the UN Human Rights Council. When we prioritize the safety of domestic violence victims, we can protect them effectively. Isabella's story proved that change was possible, and now we have proof that change works. But perhaps the most significant change was in the women themselves. Around the world, domestic violence survivors were no longer afraid to seek legal protection. The knowledge that courthouses were safe spaces had emboldened women who had previously been too terrified to report their abusers. In Seoul, South Korea, women's rights activist Lin Jo had established a global network that monitored courthouse security implementations and shared information about best practices. The network, called the Isabella Rodriguez International Safety Network, now operated in over 50 countries. Isabella's story showed us that one woman's courage could change the world. Lin told a gathering of domestic violence advocates in Seoul, "Now we have a global community of women supporting each other and ensuring that no woman has to face what Isabella faced." The legal changes were impressive, but the personal changes in Isabella's life were equally significant. She had started a foundation to support domestic violence survivors, funded by donations from people around the world who had been moved by her story. The Isabella Rodriguez Foundation provided financial assistance to women seeking legal protection, helped fund courthouse security improvements in smaller communities, and supported research into domestic violence prevention. Isabella worked from her home in Denver, but her foundation's impact was global. "I never wanted to be famous," Isabella told the UN delegates. "But I've learned that sometimes trauma can be transformed into purpose. My attack was terrible, but if it prevents other women from experiencing the same terror, then something good has come from something horrible." Isabella's daughter, Sophia, now 7 years old, had adapted remarkably well to their new life. She was too young to fully understand her mother's international fame, but she understood that her mother was helping other families stay safe. "Mommy helps scared ladies," Sophia had told her teacher when asked about her mother's work. It was a simple explanation, but it captured the essence of what Isabella's story had accomplished. The courthouse where Isabella had been attacked had become an unlikely pilgrimage site for domestic violence advocates from around the world. They came to see the security improvements, but also to honor the place where one woman's survival had sparked global change. A small plaque near the courthouse entrance read, "In memory of all victims of domestic violence, and in honor of Isabella Rodriguez, whose survival and courage changed the world. May all who seek justice here find safety and protection." As Isabella concluded her address to the United Nations, she looked out at the faces of delegates from around the world and felt something she hadn't experienced since before her marriage to Tony. Hope for the future. 6 months ago, "I was fighting for my life on a courthouse floor," Isabella said. "Today, women around the world are safer because people like you decided that change was not just possible, but necessary. My story is not unique. There are millions of women facing domestic violence every day. But now we have proof that when we work together, we can protect them." The standing ovation lasted for 5 minutes. Delegates from countries that rarely agreed on anything were united in their recognition of Isabella's courage and the global movement her story had created. After the UN session, Isabella returned to Denver to continue her foundation work. But she also returned to something even more important: her quiet life with Sophia, building a future free from the fear that had once dominated their days. The courthouses were safer now. The laws had been changed. The systems had been reformed. But perhaps most importantly, the world had learned that change was possible even after tragedy. Isabella Rodriguez's 3 minutes of terror had become a lifetime of hope for women around the world. Her legacy was not the attack she survived, but the safety she had helped create for countless others. And in courthouses from Denver to Delhi, from London to Lima, women seeking protection could now do so without fear, knowing that Isabella's story had made them safer. The world had listened. The world had learned. And the world had changed.